Okay, hey everyone, welcome to tonight's event. My name's Ethan. I'm the Secretary for the Society for Conservation Biology. Can you hear me? Yep. The Society for Conservation Biology UQ and Brisbane chapter. I'd like to thank you all for coming out, first of all, to what promises to be a really insightful evening. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our speakers, Dr. Rich Fuller, Angela Dean and Dr. Kelly Fielding. Dr. Angela Dean. It was, implied, doctor. Sorry. And to the Bearded Lady and CBCS, the Centre for Biodiversity and Conservation Science, who have both really supported us throughout this event. So what is nature connectedness? To me, it seems to be the interplay between the effect of nature on humans, but then also how humans go on to affect the nature. But I'm sure we'll find out more tonight. So everyone, let's get straight to it. We've only got a short time to learn as much as we can. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rich Fuller. At the end. Dr. Rich Fuller is an Associate Professor, ARC Future Fellow, and our designated ecologist for this evening. When Rich isn't out trying to battle the global biodiversity crisis, he's investigating how people's connection with nature can influence their conservation concern and also provide benefits. In a weird twist, Rich tells me that his first clash with nature is that he used to squish bees as a child. But yeah, I'm sure it's changed a lot since then. So I'll hand over to you, Rich Fuller.
Thanks very much, Ethan, and thanks to the Society for organising this event. It's really wonderful, and it's great to see so much interest in this. Thanks for coming. I feel bad about the bees. I've spent the rest of my life, I think, trying to atone for my faulty start in my connection with nature. So I guess, as Ethan mentioned, my career has really been focused around, well, I do several things, I do too many things, but one of my central interests is understanding the connection between people and nature, right? The reason we're here, the reason we care about conservation is because the relationship between people and nature has got screwed up, right? It's broken in some ways. And we're interested in conservation, we're trying to fix that broken relationship that we as human beings have with nature. So it seems self-evident to me, although I have to say not to many ecologists, that this is a really important issue. If we don't understand and repair our connection with nature, we've in a sense, I think, got no hope in achieving global conservation. And I guess my story in this area, it's had a long history. I began working in this area about 12 years ago. And one of the first papers that I ever read in this area stuck with me to this day. It's a paper that was published in the early 1980s. And it's really one of the foundational studies that got me completely hooked on trying to understand this stuff a bit more. And here's the story. It takes us to a hospital in Pennsylvania. And what happened in this hospital, there was a bunch of patients who were recovering from gallbladder surgery. Okay, so back then it was quite a serious thing. You had a full-blown operation. You spent a few days in hospital recovering from that operation. What the researchers did was randomly assign people who were recovering from the surgery to rooms whose windows overlooked brick walls and rooms whose windows overlooked trees and nature outside their window. That was the only difference between the two groups of patients. And I reckon you can see where this is going, right? People whose recovery rooms overlooked trees and nature outside their windows recovered on average 1.5 days more quickly from the surgery, required fewer painkillers, required weaker doses of painkillers, and got fewer negative notes from nurses on the progress of their recovery. And that was the only difference between those two groups of patients. So we're looking at real, measurable, physiological differences that simply a view of nature might give you out of a window. And that study really blew me away. And it's been cited about 3,000 times. Many of the scientists in this area are completely tired of it. But I think it is one of the most amazing, exciting papers that's ever been written in this area. And these days we're getting better data and a real deep understanding of these benefits, right, of interacting and experiencing nature, the benefits of nature for us. Here's one study that we did a few years ago. This was led by Danielle Shanahan right here in the city of Brisbane. So these are 1,500 people that live in Brisbane. They're a random sample across the Brisbane population. And what Danielle showed in this paper was that people who spend more time visiting green spaces around where they live, right here in Brisbane, have lower chances, statistically lower chances of suffering the symptoms of depression, for example. And that effect is independent of other factors which may cause depression, although it's very hard to distinguish cause and effect in these kinds of studies. But it shows that around 30 minutes spent in nature per week reduces your chances of having depression significantly and overall in the population by around 7%. So what we're seeing here is a dose effect, right? The more nature you have, the more benefit you get. It's almost like a drug, right? And for some of us, we're pretty addicted to experiences of nature. So what we're seeing, what we found in this study, was that spending time in nature results in 7% fewer cases of depression in the population and 9% fewer cases of hypertension, right, high blood pressure. And we could really start to measure these effects and work out, if we're investing in nature and experiencing nature, what benefits do we expect to see both as individuals and as a society. But there's a whole other area to all this. There's a whole other reason why I care about studying the interaction between people and nature and the connections between them. So on the one hand, as I've just talked about, there are enormous benefits from experiencing nature. On the other hand, does experiencing nature build and create conservationists? That is a really key question, I think. And I think many of you will be sitting there and intuitively answer, well, of course it does. If you don't experience nature, how can you care about it? And how can you grow up and really take action to save it? Here's some wonderful work done by Louise Chawla over in the USA, several years ago now. She asked a group of environmental professionals, why are you an environmental professional? What is it about your life path, your life course that has brought you here? And the most common thing that people said was, I experience nature. That's why I'm doing this today. I experience nature. Other people said, my family were very important in the decision. I joined organisations and so on. But the number one thing was I experienced nature as a kid. And this has become a central sort of paradigm, if you like, this idea of the extinction of experience, that if we reduce our opportunities to experience nature, then we're cutting off our concern for nature. What Louise really found, that experiences of nature were especially important during childhood. That's what people said when she interviewed them about their past. In their later years, education was more important, and later adulthood, joining organisations that cared. So experiences of nature in childhood. And you may know there's many popular books in this area, popular science books, around this idea, this nature deficit disorder. If our kids don't experience nature, we're never going to have another generation of conservationists. And of course there's a big problem here. Many of you will have heard about this. Australian children, on average, spend less time outdoors than maximum security prisoners. Right? Our doses of nature and our experiences of nature, especially as children, are in danger of declining and becoming extinct. And our experiences, the kinds of nature that we're experiencing, are changing too. The nature around where we live is different to how it used to be, and what effects is that having on our children and, of course, in our society in future. So I'm going to finish by going back to that sample of 1,500 people from across the city of Brisbane and show you some data that we have on experiences of nature and how connected people feel to nature. Here's a paper led by Julie Dean. This shows the connection to nature over the age course, over the age of the people that live in the city of Brisbane. And you can see there's an increase here. Older people are more connected to nature. I'm 46 right now, so I'm right here. So I'm looking forward to a huge explosion in my own connection to nature right now. But of course we don't know whether this is, do you suddenly change when you reach middle age? Or are we witnessing the extinction of experience right here? Right? With a weaker connection to nature here, and as these people grow, then the overall population connection to nature will decline. We don't know the answer to that question, but it's kind of a scary thought. And work that Lara Franco has been leading very recently in our lab, she's a current PhD student in our lab, has actually turned around much of my thinking in this whole area. And I'm going to end by saying I don't know what causes conservation concern. Let me explain this rather fearsome looking graph to you. On the x-axis here down the bottom, we have nature dose, right? This is one measure, the frequency at which you visit parks, from never to every week, right? So very low nature dose, very high nature dose over here. And these black bars are a measure of your experiential connection to nature. That means how much do you love nature and love being in nature, okay? So that goes up really dramatically. The more time you spend in nature, those are the people that really love it. Well, that makes perfect sense. Here's the rub. This other graph here, these open bars up here, are a measure of your conservation concern. How much you care about conservation. That shows a very, very weak, almost no relationship with experiences of nature. So people who spend more time in nature, they're the people that love being in nature, but they don't necessarily care more about conservation than people who spend very little time in nature. So this has got me worried. At this stage, I must confess, I don't know whether experiences of nature are actually that important in driving conservation concern. I care about things that I've never experienced. I've never been to an opera. And I care that opera exists in our society. I think it's possible to care for something without experiencing it often. So, I want to conclude by saying I'm confused. I don't know what causes somebody to care about conservation. We all have our own stories. I may have squashed bees, and that led me here. I wouldn't recommend that as a general approach for growing a conservation biologist. I don't know the answer to this question, but I sure hope my daughter and others of her generation grow up caring as much as you people in this room. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Very interesting. We'll move straight on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Angela Dean. Dr. Angela Dean. Dr. Angela Dean is a quantitative social scientist within UQ's School of Biological Sciences. Ange researches ways to foster environmentally friendly behaviours within communities, and explores their conservation perceptions. From seeing her plan before this talk, I do think we should be prepared for a heavy dose of nuance. Ange tells me that her first experience with nature was wanting to eat bat poo. So without further ado, I'd love to bring on Angela.
To clarify, I was 5, and it did look like passion fruit icing to my 5-year-old brain. So now Rich was a bit confused, so I'm here to set you straight, Rich. It's so again, I think I'll just start talking to the slides rather than ranting. So it's there's a load of research about how nature is good for us. There is so much that the research is almost boring. You can do a search on Web of Science or Medline and tens of thousands of papers describe how nature is good for us. And it's good in a range of ways. Having parks in cities and sometimes getting out of the house and using the park also helps. But it can be associated with reduced mortality, reduced blood pressure risk, reduced cardiovascular health problems, reduced mental health problems, and a greater sense of life purpose, more vitality, and a whole bunch of good things. What couldn't we love about that? The mechanisms by which nature does this for us are quite diverse. So in some instances, it requires us to get out of the house and use nature. So for example, when parks are more available, People are more likely to get out and use them than when they're not there. They're more likely to do physical activity, which is good for a whole range of physical and mental health. They're more likely to talk to other people, also really good for a range of social indicators, social cohesion. And we know that talking to more people has knock-on effects that are better for your health. So it's win-win-win. There's also other benefits of nature that they provide to cities that don't require us to use it. So we know that our cities are getting hotter, and cities with more trees and more natural green spaces reduce the urban heat island effect, so we have cooler cities, which is better for our health as well. So a huge range of things. Nature is good, we know that. We've also talked about nature connectedness, which is this slightly different construct, and depending on who you ask, it'll be slightly different, but it's thinking that nature is possibly part of you, or that you are part of it, or that connection between you is important in some way. And this feeling of connection is also really good for us. So again, there's a lot of studies, fewer than just about things like urban parks, but people who can connect to nature are more likely. So there's a meta-analysis of 30 studies which finds, when controlling for quite a large range of variables, that feeling connected to nature is associated with being happier. Who wouldn't want to be happy? You'd be miserable to not want to be happy. So I guess the corollary of this, and what you see a lot in the conservation science space, is what I'm going to eventually tell you as the spoiler is a simplistic assumption to go, oh, we just need to make more nature for people, we need to drag people into nature, we need to drag nature to people, problem solved. And I want to say, whilst nature is good, I'm never going to be anti more nature, but we need to not be naive about what the effect that will have. And we want to treat, for that, some of us are conservation scientists and biologists, and we need to be as rigorous with our social science and our assumptions as we are with our ecological data as well. One of the challenges, so I've got 4 main challenges that I want to present tonight, and one of them is that the causality is complex. So we've got, oh, should I do this? I'll wave my arms around too much. We'll see. So we've got people use nature. This is related to nature connectedness. Both of these are good for us and can promote health and well-being and maybe support for conservation. So the assumption is we just need to promote more nature use, people will be more connected, they'll be healthier, happier and support everything more. But it's actually a bit more complicated. So a lot of the use of nature is actually dependent on adequate health and well-being to start with, both physical or mental, and it's possible that there's these other shared drivers that enable both nature connectedness as well as the health and well-being. So for example, there's a lot of areas about, say, attachment theory from early childhood research that just says the capacity to have the wherewithal and the well-being to connect with something outside yourself, whether it's your neighbour, your colleagues or a tree, or your street, your neighbours, is an indicator that you have a general capacity for well-being that not everyone does. So can we translate that dispositional tendency to people who don't have it? So that's one of the challenges. Sometimes there's these ingredients that people have for well-being that they acquired, whether it's through good nutrition, good parenting, a happy childhood, maybe nature in childhood. But we can't assume that we can just plonk a park onto somewhere and it's going to sort out some of those challenges. The other challenge, one of the other challenges is that people don't use nature. So this is some of our data from, with Kelly, one of our studies, that was done across cities in Australia. And when we asked people whether they use parks and how recently they did, a quarter said they use parks, urban parks, almost rarely or never. And half when you say, did you go to a park in the previous week? And by using a park, we're pretty flexible. They don't have to have gone to run around or something really active. Half said they hadn't used it all. So even if we've got the parks there, we've got the, anyway, here's just a big glass over here. And the reasons people don't use nature is a whole range of reasons. So some people are actually very scared of nature. They don't. Some people don't like birds, Rich. It's very distressing. Some people have a fear about spiders and bugs and stuff. Some people just have limited mobility and actually don't feel comfortable navigating spaces where there's cyclists or people running around. Poor access in some areas where there's limited parks, they're very heavily used. So it's actually very hard to use that park in a way that does promote your well-being. And our routines don't necessarily enable. Our cities are structured to support us driving to places rather than just wander through a park on the way to somewhere else. one of the ways some people respond to this is by starting up this notion of a green prescription or a nature prescription, where we get respected individuals like health professionals, because people always do what the doctors tell you, to go and get more exercise in nature. So there's a bunch of programs around the world. They're really, really popular. They have emerging popularity. There's not a lot of good data to say how effective they are. There's one in children in the States that found out of about 5,000 nature prescriptions that were given to children, and this included free entry to a state park in the States, they had a redemption rate of 13%. So that's a little bit of an increase. That's nice. We don't know what the baseline rate of the activity of those people were. But again, the uptake of these things are not always magic. So there's two caveats to this. From the behaviour change lens, which Kelly will talk a little bit more about later, is that just simply giving people an instruction to do something, even if we say this is fabulous and so good for you, people don't always do it. They're more complex than that. The other caveat is from a public health lens. So often in public health, whether it's things about putting fluoride in the water or encouraging people to adopt that behaviour themselves, there's a real challenge. If we want the benefits of a health intervention to be accrued across everyone, rich people, poor people, well-educated people, poorly educated people, if we have an intervention that just tells people to do something, the main people that will benefit from that are the well-educated, the people who have the capacity, more funding to go and sort their lives out. So the people who don't tend to benefit from those because they don't have the capacity to change their lives are sometimes the people we need to benefit most. So from a public health perspective, we want that intervention to be rolled out across everyone and not rely on individual behaviour. The third challenge is about getting nature to people. So of course the corollary of not relying on getting people to nature is to go, well, let's put more parkland around our cities. And this is so important for so many reasons. But one of the other challenges is that a lot of social interventions can sometimes generate paradoxical effects. So urban greening solutions, and there's a few studies about this, sometimes if you channel some urban greening into, say, low income or industrial areas, which are cheap to rent, you can make them more livable and more beautiful, which is fabulous. That's the target of the intervention, but the paradoxical effect is it can then make that place more expensive to live in. So the low socioeconomic groups you were hoping to benefit from that urban greening initiative are forced to move out and other people move in. So this is not something that happens, is not rare. It happens across a lot of places, including Australian cities, and especially in areas which have low rental security, like Australia, and are quite a fluctuating housing market as well. So we can't assume that just putting more green space in certain areas will fix problems as well. We need to do it everywhere, clearly. And there are some papers, including this one by Jennifer Walsh, which is about how to make cities just green enough. So green enough to get health benefits, but not so green that they totally distort the housing market. The fourth challenge is about whether nature experience really does drive conservation support. So this is some analysis that I just did the other week, which is very exciting. I always thought this was incorrect, and I thought there's no good data to say that nature experiences promote conservation support. But this data, I think, maybe is the most interesting of what's there. So this is a longitudinal study, and there's very few longitudinal data sets in this area of people in southeast Queensland called the Habitat Study. And it's one of these large population studies of 11,000 people that measures all sorts of things about green space, physical activity, where people live, and all sorts of stuff. And what we found that a number of indicators, but not all nature experience indicators, are associated with willingness to sacrifice for the environment. So bearing some inconvenience or willing to pay more for certain things. Again, controlling for income and why you chose your suburb and physical health and things like that. And the extinction experience and Robert Pyle's theorising really says that seeing the nature regularly requires you'll feel sad about nature's loss because we're so connected with it. But I think there's a range of other potentially important pathways as well. And what we found with park recreation is that the pathways of people who spend more time recreating in parks are definitely more willing to sacrifice for the environment, but the pathways or the mechanisms are more complex. So one of those pathways is that those people feel more sadness about environmental change, but there's also other pathways as well, including well-being and social interaction. So we know that Parkland is really good for wellbeing and social interactions, and we know that from some of our research, including some with Kelly, that those are really necessary ingredients for supporting conservation outcomes, that capacity to think above yourself. So I think we need to think in a more sophisticated way about what the possible pathways are between nature experience and conservation support. And I think the point I'd really like to make is that promoting nature and nature experiences, while it's nice and lovely even, it's not the only tool in our toolbox. If we feel that this is the only pathway to create change, we are really limiting our capacity to promote conservation across the wider community. And I just want to read this, I think, awful quote from Robert Pyle, who's invented the extension of experience. And he says, "If people were closely acquainted with the plants and animals they live among, the eco-crimes they commit, abet, conduct and sponsor on a daily basis would not be so easy to bear." So basically what he's saying is, unless you can identify bugs like an ecologist, we are all doomed. And I think this is just wrong, and it doesn't do so many things. But I think these are really moralistic assumptions that exclude a lot of people from the discussion, so I have a problem with the tone. It also doesn't explain why you see strong endorsement of certain environmental campaigns like carbon reduction initiatives in inner city seats compared to rural seats where there's a lot more nature exposure. They don't also explain a recent study, which I couldn't find the citation of, that you shared last year, Rich, that said ecologists have incredibly high carbon footprints. So how are you guys abetting those crimes on a daily basis despite your capacity to identify all those species? But I think the really problem with this is there are so many tools for change, and we ignore them not only at our peril but at the environment's peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Ange. Very interesting as well. So I'll just move straight on, to our final speaker, Dr. Kelly Fielding. Dr. Kelly Fielding is an associate professor within the School of Communication and Arts and a Vice Chancellor's Research and Teaching Fellow. Her work focuses on the social and psychological dimensions of environmental sustainability, and I'm sure that she's going to bring a really unique perspective to this talk. One of Kelly's first experiences with nature is swimming in her local waterhole when she was a child, which she has now since gone back to discover is plastered with no swimming signs due to its high resident crocodile population. But I'll pass it over to Kelly to expand on that.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to do this because I do have I've already done a couple of guest lectures today and my voice is starting to fail. So thanks. And it was a bit of a shock actually, because there was this really kind of great place that we used to go to. My grandparents had this wonderful beach hut. We used to sort of go to the beach and go walking down to the swimming hole. You do that kind of trip down memory lane, where you go back and you go, I must go to the old swimming hole that we used to go to, and you go, oh, look at all those signs, don't swim, crocodiles. So that was a bit disappointing. Look, I'm not here to in any way question the importance of nature connection. Okay, so as Ange and Rich have said, it's really important for us to be connected to nature, and I bet that almost everybody in this room at the moment would think about themselves as someone who's very strongly connected to nature. I know I certainly do. I really care about nature. I really want nature to be protected. I want biodiversity to increase and not decline. And I try as much as possible, to engage in individual actions and collective actions to a lesser extent that strive to actually protect the environment, to protect nature. But you know what? I'm not always successful. My nature connection does not always translate into those positive environmental actions. And so the question is, why? Why do I sometimes act in ways that maybe harm the environment? Okay? And so I want to argue that the reason why I do that, and why a lot of us do that, is because of identity and norms. Now, what do I mean by that? Because these are social, psychological and sociological constructs that might not be familiar to all of you out there in the audience. So let me give you a little bit of a concrete example from my own life. So last year when I was on a wonderful long service leave trip. I was tripping around Europe. It was fabulous. I got this great email from some German colleagues, and they invited me to be part of a German environmental psychology summer school. And you can join your community. It's your community's popular choice. Okay, so in other words, get on board. Everybody's doing it. Now, what they found, because they measured energy conservation both before they put the messages out there and afterwards, is that in fact the most effective message was the one about the norms, that the fact that everybody else is saving energy. So that's the one that reduced energy use the most. Now, it doesn't look like a big reduction, but remember, just small reductions in energy use across the population can have big impacts. Now, one of the really great things that I love about this study is that after the study was over, they went back and they knocked on people's doors and they said, hey, do you remember that door hanger that we put over your doors? And people go, oh, yeah. And they said, how effective do you reckon that message was? And people said, the people who got the normative message said it was the least effective, even though it was the most effective at getting people to reduce their energy use. So if we know, as social psychologists, and we do know this from a whole heap of research, that norms are a powerful influence on people's behaviour, how do we harness those social norms to get people to engage in more environmental and conservation action? Well, one of the first things we have to do is be really aware of the type of messages that we're actually sending. Now, this image that's over here is a famous anti-littering campaign that they rolled out in the US many years ago. It's called the Iron Eyes Cody campaign. Now, if you'll notice, what they show in this image is a whole lot of litter. What does that image implicitly tell people? Everybody litters. Okay, so it's sending a negative message, okay, because it's kind of suggesting that everybody litters. We see this in the health information space. So we often get these messages saying a whole lot of young people are binge drinking, nobody's doing enough exercise, nobody's eating enough fruit and veg. So we're often implicitly sending messages to people that no one is engaging in the positive environmental action, or everybody is engaging in the negative environmental or health actions. And so we need to be really careful about the messages that we're sending. These bottom images are from a study that they did in the US about crafting these positive environmental or these effective environmental messages. And what you can see is that, if you reinforce the fact that everybody comes into this park and picks up a little bit of, petrified wood and kind of walks out with it, that actually leads to more theft than if you say to people, okay, well, we know it's happening, right? But please don't do it. Send the message about what is approved of. You're going to get lower levels or less negative conservation behaviour if you send those sorts of messages. Of course, we do have a lot of situations, and I think this is especially in the environmental space, where we have a lot of people go, yeah, conservation, really important, really want to protect the environment, but actually a minority of people are actually engaging in those positive conservation behaviours. So you've got a minority of people, so how do you get around the fact that if you want to communicate the social norms, what you would actually be communicating is that not everybody's doing it. So there's some recent research which I think is really exciting, which is saying, well, maybe if we can convince people that things are changing, that the norms are increasing. And so in this study, what they did was that essentially they give people the same information. 3 in 10 people, 3 in 10 Americans are starting to reduce their meat consumption, okay? But over here, the message is just like, well, 3 in 10 Americans are now reducing their meat consumption. And over here, they say, in the last 5 years, Americans have started to reduce their meat consumption, 3 in 10. And so 3 in 10 have changed their behaviour. And so people have this sense that, hey, things are changing. And they're changing for the better. And when you give people those sorts of messages, what you see is an increase in people's willingness to actually go and eat a meat-free meal. This is actual behaviour that they measured. And so if we want to live in a more sustainable world, yes, we need people to be connected to nature, we need people to care about nature, but we need to live in societies where the social norms and the social context actually facilitate that translation of that nature connection and of that concern into actual behaviour. That's what I need to say.
Thank you, Kelly. That was very interesting. So that actually concludes the final part of our speeches for tonight. So we're going to transition now to a bit more of a discussion panel. We've got some prepared questions, but after those are done, we'd love to take some questions from the audience if you guys have anything interested. And just a note, at 7:45 we're all going to move into a room just aside here, and you guys can chat with some of the researchers, and there'll also be pizza in there and everything. So yeah, moving on to questions. Yes.
Hello, I'm Narelle. I'm the Vice President for SCB, and it is now my job to facilitate this academic discussion in case it gets a bit too heated. If it does come to academic blows, I've got to say that my money is definitely, my money's on Ange. Ange would totally win that. And also, we're also here to distract you for the next half an hour until Ethan comes back with our delicious free pizza for the evening. So, to kick us off, my first question is, how flexible do each of you feel nature connectedness is over people's lifespan?
I don't know. I guess I should kick it off since I showed you some data on nature connection and age, right? There could be a genetic basis to nature connection. It's not impossible. There may be something that's quite invariant. There could be something physiological about it. Some people have suggested, I won't go into the details, but some people have suggested there is an element of physiological addiction to nature in some people through various molecular pathways and so on. These people aren't totally crazy. There's some biological meaning behind their work. So some people think that, in part, connection to nature may be partially wired in. But I don't know, we can all look at our own lives and introspect ourselves. Do we feel we've changed over our lifespan? I think it's very hard when we look back on our own lives and we ask other people to look back on their lives. It's really hard, I think, to interpret your own life. We're the worst witnesses to our own life. I kind of feel that, I'm an academic, I work in conservation, I care a lot about conservation. I interpret my history as being always driving me towards this point, inexorably driving me here. And I don't know how true that is. I really don't know the answer. There could have been some tiny thread, some small thing that happened that could have pushed me in another direction, and I just don't know how malleable that is across our lifespan. But the kind of study that Andrew was talking about, the more longitudinal studies that allow us to track people across their life, are perhaps the only way to really get at this question, I think.
I think another perspective to that, which again, none of us really know the answer, but so I have an old life working more in child development areas, and there's quite a lot of research not about nature connectedness, but about life trajectories and how our capacity to think about our willingness and interest and capacity to think about things beyond ourselves changes over time. So obviously very small children are very self-focused. There's a period in young childhood, primary age, where people do we know, you hear people who work with kids talk about it, they get very excited about nature. There's a lot of research about, say, late teenagers and young adults who at that life stage become more self-absorbed to some degree, about developing their own identity, about forging who they are as a person. But with later life stages, a whole bunch of other broader interests can penetrate that. And there is a psychological theory that talks about that as well as developmental theory, but it's got a really long obscure name. That makes no sense. Something about the age, something specificity hypothesis. But yeah, so there is a lot of research to say our interest and capacity to do a whole range of things changes with age. So it would make sense that nature connectedness potentially can as well, and that as we get older we think about society more broadly than maybe we do when we're 19, and if I can speak for myself, and that may allow it to increase.
I mean, I don't have anything much. I mean, like you both, I don't know the answer to the question, but I think one of the really interesting I often find when I talk to people that there's often an assumption that young people are the ones that are most concerned about the environment. And what I think is really interesting about the data is that the data does not support that at all, right? And so, if you look at the ABS data, it's young people and people over 65 who care least about the environment. And so I think that you could explain that in both a kind of developmental and a cohort way. That perhaps people are over 65, have grown up in a time when, that wasn't, that notion of environmental protection and environmental concern wasn't such a, kind of big issue in their lives. Young people, I think, as Ange said, there's if you're around young people, it is a kind of very self-absorbed kind of stage in life. And so, there's like you're worried about your career and your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, and so through nature or whatever. And so, so I do think that, that there are these kind of developmental stages that can influence the extent to which people might feel connected to nature and express that nature connection in terms of their concern. And, I would also say that obviously, that that the culture and the norms of your environment are going to have an impact as well. Of course, I would think that.
Perfect. So each of you have come at this topic with a slightly different perspective and from slightly different fields. What are the key theoretical shifts you feel within your own fields that have influenced your opinions on nature connectedness?
I guess I come at this from an ecological background. I only became interested in this stuff around 10 to 12 years ago, well after my PhD was finished. And I think, like many biologists, I got into biology because I loved nature. I didn't want to study people, right? So I'd say my own experience actually reflects a huge transition in our discipline of ecology and conservation science. You might think, well, conservation's all about people, right? It has to be. But that idea is quite a new idea within the field of conservation. It's only really been since really the mid to late 1990s that conservationists have really begun to think we have to understand how people interact with the natural world if we're going to have any hope of achieving conservation. And it's almost a bit embarrassing, really, to admit that within conservation science, as opposed to practice, right? I think practitioners have been aware of this for a long time. In conservation science, we've come very late to the party in trying to study people and understand people. And if we can't do that, we're never going to build a good science base for effecting change. So I've experienced that personal transition, I think, along with many thousands of my colleagues in the ecological disciplines, and more of us are reaching out in desperation to wonderful people like these two wonderful people sitting next to me to help. To help us understand people, right? And we have to do this together, and we have to achieve this multidisciplinary work that we can bridge this gap between understanding nature and understanding people. So I think that's the big transition that's happened within the biological and ecological sciences.
For me, I have quite a disparate background, some of which is in the health sphere, and I think one of the things that really influences the way I think about this is that need to be effective rather than just right. Sometimes, and I think that quote I put up for Pyle, like, maybe it's nice for everyone to know the names of 28 bug species in the area, and I know I shouldn't say bug either, but it's but is that really an effective way to move forward? And I think there's very little sense that that would be effective. So I think also part of that experience is about recognising that a single pathway of experience to outcome doesn't exist for people. And to assume that people fit this sort of textbook mould of change does us a disservice. And I think it took medicine a few decades to realise that that was a hindrance to positive outcomes, and it would be great if we could jump past that and learn quickly from other disciplines to go, we need to recognise that the things that changed us may not change everyone else, and we need to think about those tools and triggers far more diversely. Is diversely a word? But yeah, we need to really bring more rigour and complexity to that discussion, which is a great thing as an academic.
I want to echo Richard's comment that, these issues are multidisciplinary. We can't solve them as psychologists or ecologists. We need to work together. And I actually find that really exciting. I love the fact that I get to work with people from lots of different disciplines. It's an exciting part of what I do. I think that I was just in a big environmental psychology, a big psychology conference in Montreal a few weeks ago, and a stream of that is about all that travel, all those carbon, all those air miles. Actually, at the summer school, they got us to they worked out the carbon footprint of the summer school, and all these great PhD students from across Europe, caught trains, and then there was my contribution to the carbon footprint. Blew it out the water. Anyway, as I was saying, so I was at this conference and there's a whole environmental psychology stream, and I started to become quite frustrated by it, because I think there's a lot of focus on the part of my colleagues on this notion of these kind of individual factors that motivate people to take environmental action. So it's all about people's attitudes, and it's all about people's nature connectedness. And I think it really ignores the fact that we are embedded in these social worlds, that we are part of groups, we are part of family groups and friendship groups and professional groups, and those groups are really important to us. And they influence the way we think about the world and the sort of decisions that we make. And so the fact that we're not recognising the importance of those group contexts, sometimes those intergroup contexts, that's especially important in the environmental space, So we've got this issue about, political conservatives sitting over here thinking this is what we should do, and, so-called greenies over here saying, no, we should do this instead. Those kind of intergroup contexts can really influence the way that people think about and respond to environmental issues as well. And so I think that my passion at the moment is to get us to think more socially about our environmental decision making, and not to think it all comes back to us as individuals to just make decisions and forge ahead with that path, but to think about the ways in which our social context and our social groups shape our decisions and constrain them or facilitate them.
Thank you. And the final question from us, within this sphere, what is the next thing that you would like to learn? Keeping it feasible. We can't solve the conservation crisis all in one go.
Can we change learn to do?
Yes, okay. What is the next thing you would like to do within this sphere?
I think one of the challenges with this is we make a lot of assumptions and recommendations about, we just need to get people to do X, whatever that is. And I think we really need to be social science and social change and health outcomes are littered with ineffective interventions that looked perfect on paper, paradoxical interventions and things that made people worse. I think we really need to think empirically about this and test these questions. So I think we should do, and I just happen to have funding to do next year, some experimental studies looking at nature experiences in disengaged people and recruiting those through research companies and taking them out and seeing what happens. I think that would be really useful, because I think that's where, we can take us out and go, oh my goodness, that's amazing, cancel a flight, but really how can we get disengaged people to really connect in that way? And that's much harder to do.
And I just want to say that I'm on that grant with Ange, so
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that research as well. We need to do more research.
I suppose I've got two things, and I will almost certainly have forgotten what the second one is by the time I finish the first one. There's been decades and decades and decades of research on the health and well-being benefits of nature, right? And we could go on listing them for hours and hours and hours. There's absolutely thousands of them. One of the grand challenges, I think, is adding them all up. Right, so there's many studies that study one particular benefit in one particular place of one sort of nature. What we've never done is build the big, giant picture of really getting at what is the total grand contribution of nature to the human enterprise, to human well-being, to us as a species. And we've been very poor, I think, at really articulating and measuring the totality of all of those benefits. You take the hundreds and hundreds of different health benefits that have been studied, and you add them all up and you try and estimate the total contribution to human well-being. So I think that's the kind of area that we need to be going in. There are people making good moves in that area, and I think we need to be really ambitious and build that picture as strong as we can, making a case for investing in nature because our lives depend on it. I'll stop there.
Okay, so question time is now open to the audience. If anyone's got a question, just throw up your hand.
Yep. Taking into account all of the social behaviours that we could do, or all of the directly interventionist behaviours we could do, or anything in that nature, if you've got 100 people in this room, what is the most effective action that you would recommend for us to take away to then either tell people or try and influence those we know or perform in our own lives? What would you want us to do as 100 people in the audience?
There's actually not really good data about that, and that's part of the study we've got funding for. But so in a year's time, I'll tell you a really evidence-based answer to that question. But in the meantime, I think effective climate action is the make or break issue, and lights and light switches are not going to cut it. And really, if all of you go and convince 100 people each, to then go and convince 100 people each, to then all turn up at Malcolm Turnbull's home door. And, that's an exaggeration. But yeah, if we can actually set that message, like a lot of us endorse carbon reduction policies of various natures, but they're not things you can see us doing, so it's hard to activate those norms. We can stick on a sticker and things, but how to make that concern active, turn it into a behaviour, a petition, a letter, telling someone and encouraging them to do likewise, make it a visible action.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. I think that advocacy is the answer. So we as environmental psychologists spend a lot of time kind of going, how do we get people to recycle more? How do we get people to turn off their light switches? But in fact, what we should be asking, and this is what the paper recently talking about, the concerned scientist paper says, we need grassroots action, we need political change, and so really we need to be engaging in more of that advocacy action.
Very, very quickly, Andrew Bamford from Cambridge University recently published a paper and has been doing a whole bunch of work where he's tried to answer this question extremely explicitly. He visited UQ a couple of weeks ago. I sat down and had lunch with him, and he said, I'm afraid it's very clear what the number two things are, what the two number one and two actions are, and they're extremely unpopular. Don't have children and don't eat meat, was what he said to me. And I don't know whether to agree or disagree with those actions, but those are the ones he passed to me. I also think, on perhaps a lighter note, we should do what we're good at. I don't actually think there is a single prescription, right? If you have a spare dollar or a spare hour, you should do something you're good at that's going to generate good outcomes for who you are and what your skills are. I kind of think, I'm not sure I quite believe there's a very clear prescription. I think human society is much more complicated than just the sum of the behaviours of the consumptive behaviours of all the individuals in it. So I think we have to be smart about how we deploy our resources. I read a brilliant blog, sorry this answer is getting a bit long, but I read a brilliant blog the other day where this blogger said, you know, instead of fretting for 4 hours about which kind of plastic to recycle, maybe you should just work and earn some money and donate it to someone who knows what they're doing. You know, just be smarter about the way we think about using our resources and our time and our energy and our money in effective ways. And I think the answer is different for all of us.
Can I just add though, Rich was talking about prescriptions. There are special prescriptions you can get that help you not have children, just if you want. Just talk to your doctor.
Rich, this question is mainly for you, and it's set against the backdrop of human drivers for biodiversity loss. So, one primary way to get people exposed to nature is to go to a protected area, but a lot of the wilderness discourse kind of promotes fortress-style conservation, so it may cut that link. But I'm quite interested because all three of your experiences in nature weren't in protected areas, which perhaps suggests that conserving nature in a human-dominated matrix may actually be the solution to fostering a conservation ethic. So I just want to get your opinion on that.
Well, yeah, look, there's a lot in there. Conserving nature, I don't know where to start. There is research on different kinds of nature experiences, right? So there is specific research around wilderness experiences of nature and the value, the transformative effect they can have on people, right? So that type of nature experience, it may be very dramatic, it may be quite rare in your life, and it may happen a long way from sort of literally and figuratively from where you normally spend your time. There is some evidence that those kinds of nature experiences can have really transcendent effects and actually fundamentally change someone's life, even though they're very rare. So on the one hand, I'd say there's an important possible role of wilderness experiences in fostering nature connection. On the other hand, as you rightly point out, almost all of our interactions with nature happen very close to our homes, around where we live. 90% of Australians live in cities. Almost all of our interactions, day on day, day in, day out, year after year, are happening in cities. And what happens to the nature in cities fundamentally dictates what those interactions with nature are going to look like. So I agree with you that I think thinking carefully about the kind of nature that we have in our cities and the ways in which we encourage and support each other in society to experience nature, I think is really important. But I think there is a sting in the tail here. The more you experience nature, are you really going to see it as something that is in decline and rare, right? It's almost a paradox here. The more you experience nature, perhaps the less likely you are to see it as something that is rare and threatened and declining. So I think there's some real challenges here. The other thing, finally, that people have thought about and done some research on is the effect of seeing destruction of nature. And that's one thing that I think does change in our life course. I've noticed it more and more. And you know, you talked about this a bit, this idea that something I love has been taken away. And I've seen places where I used to go bird watching as a kid that have now turned into car parks and all of this kind of stuff. And I think witnessing first-hand environmental destruction is a powerful driver and can, I think, sort of perhaps translate a connection to nature into real, perhaps sorrow, but also anger and concern and action. And I don't know what I'm recommending. Am I recommending we take people out and bulldoze their favourite childhood playground in front of them? I don't know what I'm recommending as such, but there's a lot of depth to this, I think.
So, as you guys, most of you know me, but I used to do a lot of ecology, and I've gone to the dark side of tech design. And technology has its consequences, knowing that it uses uranium and cobalt and all these things. But what I'm interested in is engaging people with nature, using tech as augmenting their experience through tech and giving them exposure to nature that they may not otherwise have. And I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that and how effective that may or may not be.
There's a little bit of data, but not fabulous enough to answer the question probably about is watching a movie about nature like a David Attenborough stuff enough. And I think you can get, depending on what outcome you're measuring, you can get a little bit of a boost of some sort of, oh, that's nice response, but they tend not to alone be associated with the long-term sort of change. With the new technology, like there's loads of VR stuff now, so Coral Watch, which some of you know is out in the outback bringing corals to the bush as part of National Science Week, using VR technology. I think we need to really I think we need some data. Next study, guys. So, yeah.
I'll be on that one.
Yeah, join us. Or we'll join you, or whichever way.
And I guess on a